Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Christopher Tuttle, an archaeologist whose research on the Hellenistic and Roman periods in the Middle East. Chris joined ASA in 2009, and he leads our tours to Jordan, Tunisia, Sardinia and Corsica, the Greek islands, and along the Turquoise coast to Rhodes and southern Turkey. Chris has an extensive and impressive CV that includes a PhD from Brown University, field work in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and for 8 years was the Associate Director of the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman in Jordan. His particular area of expertise is the ancient kingdom of the Nabataeans and their capital city of Petra. As well as this being the focus of his PhD, Chris has been closely involved in the excavation, survey and conservation work that has been undertaken at Petra, and he co-directed the Brown University Petra Archaeological Project, which conducted the most extensive landscape survey to date in the northern Petra hinterlands. He truly is a world authority on this subject. So this evening, Chris will present the first of our special two-part lecture series on the Nabataeans. So for the next hour, Chris will introduce us to these fascinating people with a lecture entitled The Nabataean Kingdom, a historical overview of who, where, and when. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, so welcome everyone to ASA's special lecture series on the Kingdom of the Nabataeans. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoyed this first part of the two-part lecture series. Today, as Julia said, we're going to be really setting the stage in a large part because we're going to be talking about the who were the Nabataeans, where they were, and when they were, and really taking a look at how we've learned what we've learned about them over the last 200 plus years. Tomorrow's lecture, entitled Masters of Water and Trade, will focus more on how they came to power and what they did with their power and their wealth. And that's where we'll see a lot more of the monuments and talk about the legacies that they have had on the region and our cultures in general. So without any further ado, we will proceed. So I'm going to try to go through this fairly cleanly and quickly, but a lot to cover. So hopefully I won't forget anything. All right, so the best place to start is, since we're going to be talking about how we as scientists really began the study to understand the Nabataeans, I thought it would be fun to start with an anecdote about myself. The awakening moment for me was sitting in the theater in 1989 watching Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And those of you who have seen the movie will remember that exciting moment when Indy and his team is galloping through the valley between the steep cliffs, and they come up to this gorgeous rose red facade, which in the movie, of course, is fronting the Temple of the Holy Grail. But I sat there in the theater and I looked at that and I thought, I remember that. And it took me back to my childhood when I had read about this ancient city, this lost city, or this mysterious culture in some book. And I don't remember what the book was, but I read a lot of those like Time Life series that were so popular in the 1970s and 80s. And I sat there in the theater, really not paying attention to the movie anymore, thinking, this is what I'm going to do. Because I was at a point in my life where I was finishing up my undergrad and I was planning to go to grad school in archaeology. And it was at that moment that I kind of really decided I'm going to work on studying these people. I want to know about the people who made this amazing structure. So that was sort of my awakening toward the quest of discovering who the Nabataeans were. But that facade of the treasury, and here again on the left, and another facade at Petra known as the monastery, and the one on the left from the movie is called the treasury, Al-Khazne. And as people who traveled with me will learn, like none of these names actually have any meaning in relation to the original function of the monuments. They're much later names that were assigned by the Bedouin who moved in and inhabited the ruins. And these facades that you see here on the screen at Petra, or these facades of the tombs that we see in Hegra or Madi'in Salah in northwest Saudi Arabia, these have become the iconic images that people sort of they see these, and if they know about the Nabateans, they think, oh, Nabataean. But when the whole quest to discover about the Nabataeans began, nobody even knew about these facades yet. So the facades, although they're iconic today, when the real effort began to discover who are these Nabataeans, nobody knew about the facades yet. And this all began really in Europe as a result of the Renaissance, followed by the humanism movement and subsequently the Enlightenment. And the reason for this is because during that period between the 15th and 19th century, most educated Europeans or people of European descent were educated on a classical literature model. They all learned to read ancient Greek and Latin, and they read the preserved classical authors. It was really the basis of a lot of that education. And amongst those authors were these three men. You have Diodorus Siculus, or Diodorus of Sicily, Strabo, the geographer, and Flavius Josephus, all writing in the window between mid first century BC, so like 50 BC to 50 AD, roughly. And they all three made up a big part of this classical education system. And the reason I'm including them here is because they also are our three primary literary sources from the ancient world that talk about the Nabataeans. So anybody who was becoming an explorer or a antiquarian in the 18th or 19th centuries, or even the early 20th centuries, very likely had encountered the name Nabataean or Nabataioi in Greek and knew of these people and even knew of this city of Petra. But at that point, nobody knew where it was. So that's why I'm starting this whole framing of who, where, and when. But I want to note that none of these images are authentic. They are 18th and 19th century drawings of these authors. No actual portraits of them exist. And I also want to make a comment going forward that whenever you hear people talk from that time period or even today about the lost cities or the lost civilizations, it's really important that we unpack that terminology, because in reality, they were only lost to the Europeans and not to the people who lived in the region. And so when we talk about the rediscovery of Petra, what we're really talking about is a re-identification of Petra, because it was not really lost to the people who lived in the area. So that's just an important distinction to think about when we throw a lot of these words around. The main reason that the city was considered lost in the European world was because of the Ottoman Empire. And here on the left, you can see a map that shows the extent of the Ottoman Empire in about the 17th century, say around 1650, 1660. And you can see just how much territory around the Eastern Mediterranean that the Ottoman Empire controlled. On the right-hand side of the screen is a map that shows the empire a little later, actually quite a bit later, at the end of the empire, or right before the onset of World War I. So looking again at the map on the left, this region was lost to many European travelers, Christian European travelers. It really was not safe for people to travel in this region between the 16th and 19th centuries. And I won't go into all the geopolitical and religious ideology that was the problem there. Let's just suffice to say that it could often and usually lead to your death if you were wandering around the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of these sites in the ancient Middle East and North Africa were not open to the people who are reading about them in these ancient texts. You can see on the left here, I've put up a map that shows the extent of the Nabataean Kingdom at its height, which would say be the end of the first century BC and through the first century AD. And on the right, I'm showing you the Ottoman Empire again, but what territories it controlled exactly in the year 1812. And right here, this area, of course, is the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel, Palestine, and Jordan are right here. And it was still solidly in the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire in 1812 covered basically the whole territory that was once the Nabataean Kingdom. And 1812 is important because it is 1812 when the first European explorer actually made it to the ancient city of Petra and re-identified it as Petra that they had all been reading about in these ancient texts. And this man, Johannes Ludwig Burckhardt, was a Swiss-born explorer who had emigrated to Britain and at the time had been hired by the British African Association to go into South Egypt and Sudan and then on to other parts of Africa to map out some irregularities that they had in the cartography related to some of the rivers, most notably the Niger River and parts of the Nile. In order to prepare for this, he went to University College London for a while, learned Arabic, ultimately learning several dialects of Arabic. And it is said by some sources that as an adult male, he even went and had himself circumcised because Muslims, like Jews, circumcise. And if he was going to be traveling incognito in the Muslim world, he would be at risk of being exposed as not being Muslim if he was not, in fact, circumcised. So this man was dedicated. He then set out in 1809 for Syria, and he worked his way into Aleppo in northern Syria, and he spent 2 years there learning yet more Arabic dialects, making test excursions into the hinterlands of Syria and northern Palestine to see if he could pass and whether he would be discovered. And he created this persona while he was there, and that's being shown here in this drawing on the left. He became Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah, and he was so good at passing that he managed to do all of this and never be exposed for not being Muslim. So in 1812, which is why the year is important, he headed south finally toward Aqaba in order to then transit across the northern part of the Red Sea to the Sinai Peninsula and make his way onto Cairo. And as he was traveling down the inland road, which is on the plateau in Jordan, his guides, local guides that he was traveling with and other traveling companions, kept talking about a city that was hidden in the mountains to the west of them, which you had to go off the plateau and down into the mountains. And that intrigued him because on his way to Syria, he had stopped in Malta. And while he was in Malta, he had heard about a German explorer named Ulrich Seetzen, who had set off a couple of years earlier from Cairo to go north to specifically try to find this city of Petra that was talked about in the literature. Unfortunately, Seetzen was killed. He was murdered, and so it was a bit of a cautionary tale. Nonetheless, Burckhardt on this travel toward Aqaba heard about this location, thought, this could be it. And he knew from the discussions with the people that on a mountain to the south of Petra, about 11 kilometers actually from Petra, is the tallest mountain in the region. It's called Jebel Harun. And Jebel means mountain. Harun is the Arabic version of Aaron. Aaron being the brother of Moses, the mouthpiece of Moses. And in the Jewish and Muslim traditions, it is here on this mountain where Aaron dies and he's buried. Now, because he's a prophet, Nebi, meaning prophet, Nebi Harun, the Muslims revere him like they do Moses and Jesus and many of the other prophets from the Old Testament, and Jesus being from the New Testament, of course. So in the 14th century, the Muslims under the Mamluks built a shrine up here to commemorate the death of Aaron. And Burckhardt, being a smart man, thought, so this is my way in. So he convinces his guide, I made a vow to pay homage and make a sacrifice to the prophet Aaron. So can we go? And it took some finagling, but eventually he convinced them, and they took him into Petra Valley, which you have to go through to get to this mountain. And that's how he got into Petra. And he was the first to see these facades. And although they were only there for a night and part of a day, they did have to camp overnight in the valley. He was able to get away furtively and go into some of the monuments, one of which was that treasury, that famous facade we also saw in the Indiana Jones movie. And he made some sketches. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you're seeing the map he very quickly drew of the valley of Petra. And it's surprisingly accurate given how little time he actually had. And on the left, I've just included a 19th century drawing from one of these early travelers to Petra that came after Burckhardt, showing pilgrims on their way to that welly, which is perched up on the mountain up here. So that's how Petra was re-identified in the 19th century, in the year 1812. Although it was still difficult to travel in this part of the world, it kind of opened the floodgates over the next couple of decades. And a lot of people set off, and bribes were paid, and they were able to get in and out of the Ottoman Empire and make their way to Petra and visit this site. And although Burckhardt was the first to get there, and he did some drawings and sketches, his stuff unfortunately was not published until after some later travelers. But nonetheless, he is still credited with the re-identification. So here I've just included 3 examples of drawings that were made by some of these early travelers. During those decades after 1812, there wasn't a whole lot of science going on. People were going there to see the monuments, to do their art. They were really only interested in inscriptions, so what little bit of science was done was mostly finding the inscriptions carved on the facades or on the walls of the cliffs and recording them. And they mostly were producing stuff like this, which was very popular back on the continent, European continent, and in the UK, for magazines like London Illustrated and so forth, and books, big coffee table type books with these elaborate, beautiful drawings. But then in 1869, the very first photographs were taken. And this is a great story, but I'm going to keep it short. This was done by a group of Dominican friars from the École Biblique et Archéologique Française de Jerusalem. And they loaded up this monstrous camera with over 100 glass plates. And the glass plates themselves were, I don't know, half a meter square at least. And they carried them all on donkeys and camels across the mountains from Jerusalem, down into the Dead Sea Valley, back up into the mountains, and made their way to Petra, and took the very first photographs. And I've just included 3 here to show you what the monuments looked like in 1869. And these are the first photographs. And I've included all this material, the drawings and the photographs, just to show you what was really sort of going on, because it wasn't yet science. The Dominican friars were definitely doing the most science of anybody who had visited prior to 1869. In reality, the science didn't really take off there, again, largely due to the difficulty and the cost of getting there. It wasn't until the first decade of the 20th century, 1900 to 1910, where a lot of this early, solid, we still use it today, research was done. And the first of these is on the left-hand side of the screen. That is Arabia Petraea by Alois Musil, a Czech explorer who went all through Transjordan and Palestine and into a little bit into northern Arabia and parts of the Sinai, and did an amazing survey. And it's so thorough that we still use it today. The next expedition was a group of German scholars, actually Austrian and German, Brunau and von Domažuski, and that's the middle book. And this is the original gazetteer of all the monuments. There are over 800 tomb facades inside Petra, and they recorded all of them and numbered them, setting up the inventory system that we still use today. And finally, on the right-hand side is 2 more Dominican friars from the École Biblique in Jerusalem, Fathers Josen and Savignac, who were a couple of gun-toting monks. These guys actually had 6-shooters, Colt 6-shooters, and they rode camels, and they went into northwest Saudi Arabia, and did the first archaeological survey that had ever been done there, and recorded the other Nabataean site with carved tomb facades, Nabataean Sala, or the ancient site of Hegra. So that is the first real science that was done. And this all came out between like 1904 and say 1914. And then what happened in 1914? We have the onset of World War One. And really, no more science on the Nabataeans takes place until the 1930s as a result of the World War and the aftermath. So the first archaeological excavations and more surveys, but really it's the excavations that finally get under the way in the 1930s. And that takes place in the southern Negev Desert in what is today partly Israel. And then the very first excavations at Petra also took place starting in 1930. And they were led by the famous British archaeologist Margaret Murray, who is famous for the archaeological work that she did in Egypt, specifically around the Fayum region. And then 1930, what happens? In that decade, we have the Second World War. And so once again, no archaeological work really gets done at all in any of this region until the 1940s and 1950s, really 1950s. So given that it was re-identified in 1812, it took a long time for us to begin getting the data necessary to try to answer some of these questions of the who, the where, and the when are the Nabataeans, and where were they and when were they? So let's begin now to try to answer those three questions. And we'll start with what is actually the easiest, the where. And as I've shown you already on the left, this map that shows the extent of the Nabataean Kingdom. On the right-hand side is just another version of that, but you can see the little white dots. I know it's very small, but the white dots are where the major urban centers are. Probably the most important thing to realize here, though, is, again, the same map on the left. And look at the map on the right. This is a map showing all the major trade routes, both the overland trade routes and the sea routes coming from India and points further east. So we're talking about spices and incense and indigo, dye, and all these other very expensive, very luxury goods had to come onto this peninsula and then make their way overland to then be shipped to Rome and other points on the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll be talking about that specifically tomorrow with the trade, but I wanted you to see the juxtaposition of the extent of their kingdom and where the trade routes are. And you can see that the Nabataeans were smack dab solidly on top of all of these trade routes, except this one here that went through Palmyra, which was an extension of the Silk Road. Nabataeans did not control that. So that's the where. Let's talk a bit about the when, and this is where it's going to get a little bit complicated. It's a lot of text, and I apologize for that. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, just picking out a couple of key points to help you frame where we are. The first time we hear about the Nabataeans in literature is in 312 BC, the very first item there on the list, and it's during the Wars of the Diadochoi. And the Diadochoi are the generals of Alexander the Great, who divided up his empire into 5 kingdoms upon his death in 323 BC. And it's in the context of a struggle between two of these that I'll show you in a moment on a map, the Antigonids and the Ptolemies, where we first hear about the Nabataeans. Then there's nothing definitive that we have until one of those excavations I mentioned earlier, 1930s excavation at the Nabataean city of Halassa, to modern Alusa in the Negev Desert, where an inscription was found, which to this day is still the oldest known Nabataean inscription. And it dates to 169 BC, and it mentions Aretas. We call him Aretas the First, and he's the first Nabataean king. We can then skip over a couple of these, noting that at 75 BC, plus or minus, is when the grand urbanization of Petra, the capital city, happens. And 64 BC, right after that, is when Pompey the Great, the Roman, kicks the final Seleucid king out of Syria and annexes Syria as the first province of Rome. That's important. Noting here as well that Herod the Great has a link to the Nabataeans because his mother was a Nabataean woman. 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, which of course is where Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian. And it's important because the Nabataeans supported Octavian, not Antony and Cleopatra. And then finally, they just jump down to the end. The kingdom of the Nabataean comes to an end as an independent government, an independent polity in 106 AD when it is annexed as a new province to the Roman Empire. So here's that map, and it shows in the different colors. You've got the Seleucid kingdom over here covering Mesopotamia. Antigonus got the Asia Minor and parts of Macedon over here, and then Cassandra and Lysimachus, and Ptolemy down here in Egypt. And it's this point right here where the green and purple meet that really is what we're concerned about. That's where the Nabataean kingdom was. And it was the struggles between these generals that went on for 2.5 centuries that laid the stage for how independent local kingdoms like the Hasmonean kingdom in Judea, who was the preceding kingdom to Herod the Great's kingdom, and the Nabataeans came to power because these generals just wore their kingdoms out. They left power vacuums, and these local kingdoms were able to emerge during that window between 322 BC down to late 200s BC, so like 205 and so forth. So it went on for a long time. So the other information that we have about when comes from the things like inscriptions and these rare papyri that I'm showing on the 2 slides to the right. On the left is that very first and oldest Nabataean inscription that we know of that names the king Aretas. On the right are 2 examples from the Zenon papyrus archive that was found in Egypt. Now, there is an altar stele in a museum in Damascus that has a Nabataean inscription, and it refers to a man named Rabel and his men. And the Zenon papyri also mention Rabel and his men and give us the name Nabataeoi. Both the inscription in Damascus and these papyri both date to about 260 BC. And it is thought that this Rabel may be an earlier king, which would put the Nabataeans as having a king of 100 years earlier than this inscription on the left, which is the first definitive mention we have. So that's interesting because it tells us that there's a lot still that we may not know about the development of the monarchy and the rise of the kingdom. Rabel, Rabbel, is actually a name that appears several times in amongst the kings of the Nabataeans. And in fact, the very last king, the one who died before the annexation of Rome, his name was Rabel II. And there was a Rabel I, but there may have been a Rabel the Zero, is what I'm saying. So here we are, just a quick visual overview. 312 BC on the left, 106 AD on the right. And this is a quick timeline showing how long the Nabataeans existed as a socio-political identity. And it was about 420 years. They were the longest surviving independent kingdom in the region. They were the last independent kingdom to give in to Rome. And then I mentioned much earlier about our literary sources. And the most important of these for this early time period regarding who are these people and where did they come from is Diodorus Siculus. And I've summarized here some of the things that he tells us about them when he's recounting what happened in 312. And in 312, what happened is Antigonus was headed down to attack Ptolemy, and he came across this valley with these people called the Nabataeoi, and he plundered them and went on his way. And in telling this story, the source that Diodorus Siculus is quoting tells us that they live in the open air. They live in a wilderness where there's no rivers nor abundant springs, that it's their custom not to plant grain or any fruit-bearing tree, and not to construct houses. And if anyone is found doing any of these things, death was the penalty. Otherwise, they raised camels, they raised sheep, and pastured them in the desert. And the other thing that was this known already in 312 was they were very wealthy. And although we're told by Diodorus that the entire tribe numbered only about 10,000 people, because they were bringing frankincense and myrrh from the desert to the sea, as well as other spices, they were very wealthy. So that is kind of the first glimpse we have of the earliest period of the Nabataeans. What other sources can we learn from? They are the inscriptions. So I've given you two examples here of formal inscriptions, one from Petra on the left, one from Hegra on the right. Studying language can tell us a lot about the origins of a people. Like, does the language share anything with other languages that we know? What is the evolution of the script? Can we find parallels? And of course, what is the information that's actually in the inscriptions? In most cases, the inscriptions don't tell us anything much beyond what we still know. They'll name kings sometimes. What we do get from them are personal names, and a lot of personal names included elements of a god's name, just like Abdullah, an Arabic name today, means servant of Allah, Abd Allah. The Nabataeans used a similar naming convention. So we can learn a bit about the religion, and we get a big list of personal names. And in the case like the inscription on the right here from Hegra, it also gives us a glimpse at their legal worldview, because this inscription actually has a curse and a legal prescription. Like, anybody who uses this tomb who is not part of this family, this is how much they have to pay the government, and may they be cursed, and blah, blah, blah. So inscriptions can tell us a lot about things within the worldview, but they don't always tell us much about things like origins. Here we also have informal inscriptions, and we got lots of them throughout the Nabataean Kingdom. And these are graffiti, essentially. And these tell us much the same sort of thing. A lot of personal names, little glimpses at gods, maybe expressions of what people want because they're beseeching a god for a favor, things like that. And of course, they also help us identify the evolution of the script. And so I've just included an example of some of these from the Sinai Peninsula to give you a flavor of them. And then the last source we have is very rare, and it is papyri that are written with Nabataean. And here's two examples from the same and only cache of such papyri that's ever been found. It's called the Nabata archive because the woman who it belonged to and whom the documents are about was named Nabata, and she was a Jewess from a village on the south end of the Dead Sea who had been married to a Nabataean man, and their son was therefore Nabataean. He dies. She has to travel up the mountains to Petra from the Dead Sea to adjudicate her son's rights. And she was very smart, and she kept copies of all the documents. And on the left is a formal document written in the hand of a scribe. On the left is a bilingual document written in Greek on the top and Nabataean on the bottom. And that handwriting is that of a layperson. It's not scribal. So it gives us a glimpse at that. And what's really important about all of these inscriptions and this example of a layman writing is we know that the Nabataeans were a very literate people. Everyday people could just go up to a cliff somewhere in the desert and carve an inscription. So we're dealing with people who could read their own language, write their own language, and because of their trade, they spoke Greek and Aramaic, and later on they would learn Latin. So a very, very literate people. But the irony of ironies, we have no literature from them. So we have lots of inscriptions and no literature. We have no histories, no annals, no novels, no plays, no poems. So for a very literate and polyglot people, it's really striking that nothing written in their own voice that tells us about them has survived and come down to us. It's kind of the holy grail, to go back to the beginning of Nabataean studies, is for someday to find an archive of these sort of texts, and it hasn't happened yet. And finally, on the script, I just want to show you the evolution of the script. This is just a chart showing how the letter forms change across time. And this represents about 600 years. And you will note that 600 is more than the 420 I mentioned earlier for the length of the kingdom. But that's because even though the kingdom disappears in 106 AD, it ceases to exist as a political entity. The people didn't change. They're still using their own language and still they're writing their own texts and whatnot. And so we're dealing here with a language that is a distinct language, but it also is not. We call it Nabataean, but it's more technically correct to call it Nabataean Aramaic because it's written in a modified Aramaic script. And of course, Aramaic was the language of Jesus and was used as a lingua franca all throughout the region for hundreds of years, for centuries. And the Nabataeans borrowed that script to modify for themselves. Their own language is more of a Proto-Arabic. So it's a Proto-Arabic language that's being written in a modified Aramaic script. And what's fascinating is that it is this cursive shaped letters that we see that would ultimately evolve into what we think of as modern Arabic script today. So what else can tell us about who these people were? And religion is another one that we often look to see, okay, what did they believe? Do they have parallels that we've identified elsewhere? And with the Nabataeans, we find this is true and it's not true. So we're back to this thing with the Nabataeans. Like every time we think we've got a piece of the puzzle, we discover that it only is a partial piece of the puzzle. So here you're seeing a shrine in Petra carved way up under a cliff on a mountain. And you can just make it out on the left here. You can see it here. And I've included a closer up version in a slightly better light on the right-hand side. And what's fascinating here is you've got this bust in a circular idicula, and beneath it is this plain rectangular stela, what we call a betel. And this is an aniconic, that means without icon, type of representation for deities. And it was actually quite common amongst peoples in the region. We find it amongst other peoples in northwest Saudi Arabia and all the way down into Yemen. And of course, we know about the Jews having a do not depict, no graven image as well. So it is part of the milieu of this region in the earlier centuries. And the Nabataeans clearly did that. But because they have interactions with this Hellenistic world and later on with the early Roman world, they also bring in and absorb and adopt the use of iconography to represent their gods. And this shrine epitomizes that synthesis because it's depicting the same god. The figure shown, the bust at the top, is an image of their main god, Dushara, and the betel at the bottom is also an image of the main god, Dushara. It's the older, more traditional way of rendering the god. And the one on top is been brought in, it's an influence, it's been absorbed and incorporated. So we also then have these. And these, again, a different type of betel, fancy word. It's from the Greek meaning house of God, Bethel in Hebrew or Betelos in Greek. And we shorten it in English and call it a betel because these are houses of God. But on the left and in the center are what we call eye betels for obvious reasons. They're shown with eyes, nose, and sometimes a mouth. These are unique to the Nabataeans, and they're this native blend of aniconic and iconic, question mark. We really don't know. What we do know is that every time there's an inscription, like the one listed here on the bottom of the figure on the left, every time there's an associated inscription carved on a wall next to it, or actually carved on the object itself, it refers to a goddess. So it appears that these eye betels are unique to depictions of the goddess. And the main goddess was called Alat in most of the kingdom, or Al-Uzza at Petra. And so there was a main god and a main goddess, and there was a pantheon of other gods, many of whom were shared with other peoples from the regions further to the south and a little bit further to the east. And on the right, we have just another example of one of these plain betels. And usually when we see these, we're pretty sure they are representations of the god, but not always, because sometimes we find plain betels with inscriptions associated that mention a goddess. So it can be very hard when you just have these carved features on the side of a cliff to know exactly what's going on if there is not an associated inscription or something else that helps us identify it. Here's the final image I'll use. This is another religious shrine in Petra, way up on another mountain. And I like this image because it's an overhang. It's so big, you can't get it all into one photograph. But what's of interest here is this on the left. This is a horned altar. And if you're familiar with early Israelite religions in Yemen, religions in Mesopotamia, a lot of religions in this ancient world over the millennia leading up to the time of the Nabataean Kingdom use these depictions of horned altars. What's different in the case of the Nabataeans is sometimes the altar is the betel, which is the representation of the god. So they are playing around with this ability to represent their gods differently than we see amongst any other peoples at the time. So on the left, you've got the horned altar, but just in case you weren't clear that this is a religious thing, in the middle here, there's a little niche that has a betel. And the betel is only about, I don't know, it's probably 12 centimeters or 10 centimeters in size. So it's quite fascinating. And then just a plain betel here. Now, we also have these two empty niches. And these sometimes, the empty niche is, again, the representation of the god. It's an aniconic representation of the god. So there was never anything in these. The whole is itself a representation. But sometimes they also were used for you to come and place a portable figure. So it's hard to tell. And what does all this tell us? Well, the Nabataeans were sharing religious elements with a lot of the peoples around them. And they even shared gods with some of the other tribes and clans and stuff that we know of from other sources, further to the south in Saudi Arabia, further to the east in what is today Saudi Arabia, but not quite the same. So it reveals a little bit about who they are and what their origins are, but it's not at all definitive. So who? We've answered where, we've answered when, but who? Who we still cannot answer. The short answer is we still don't know who the Nabataeans were or where it was that they originated. Our best theories, and there's four main theories, but I've only selected the first and what I consider to be the best of the two. And one is the Arab origin theory. And this idea holds that the Nabataeans were a tribe, an integrated single tribe that originated somewhere in southern Arabia or Yemen, and over the period of 2 centuries, emigrated further north. And we have linguistic evidence, historical evidence, cultural evidence that really lends a good support to this idea. And of course, I mentioned there, one of the biggest elements is that their language has really strong parallels to earlier Proto-Arabic languages in that region. But then there's the Confederation of Tribes theory, and that is that the Nabataeans weren't ever just a single tribe, but rather was an amalgamation of peoples, other Arab tribes, Edomites, Aramaeans, Greeks, Jews, who were living in a region and banded together by choice and chose a common form of leadership. And there is historical, linguistic, and interestingly enough, genetic evidence to support this. Neither one, though, is completely definitive, and personally, I think it's a combination of these two theories, but that's just me. Join us for part 2, where we're going to now pick up on what we know about the origins and the locations and the timing of the Nabataean Kingdom, and we're going to take a deeper look at what they created at the time. So with no further ado, I'd like to say thank you very much, or in Arabic, shukran. And I'd be happy to take a few minutes to answer any questions that people might have.
Yep, I do have a question for Chris.
Yes, please.
You mentioned in your talk that the Petra and the Nabataean were reinterpreted, rediscovered by the Europeans, let's say, quite early because of the Ottoman Empire preventing any research being done. So I guess my question is there any significant research that has been done by the Ottomans during this period of time?
Okay, yes. So that would be between the 15th and 19th centuries, really. It's when the Ottomans were in their heyday of power. And the answer is no. They really were not interested in anything that wasn't specifically linked to their own history, where they were constantly needing to justify the history of their hanging on to power. But also, if it wasn't Islamic, they had no interest in it. So the answer is really no. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions?
Well, in that case,
Wow.
no.
You are such an easy crowd. Given that this was a two-part series, I felt it was really necessary to establish what we know and how we know it, so that we then can go on and actually talk about more of what they created and what the legacy they left behind.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Good night. Thank you for joining.
Our pleasure.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was fabulous.